Yeah.
Pick up my husband.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to the session, Patients, the New Economy of Healthcare. I am Cynthia Grossman. I am Director at FasterCures, a center of the Milken Institute based in DC. And I have the honor to moderate this esteemed panel of what I like to call healthcare disruptors. I know we have a panel in the session, like later on in the afternoon, with the actual disruptors in the title, so don't get confused. But to me, these folks, these good folks here on the panel, are what I would consider to be healthcare disruptors. So let me start by way of introduction, and then I'll make a few remarks to set the stage for our discussion today. We will be opening it up for questions for about 10 minutes toward the end, so be thinking about your questions and hold on to them. We'll have a mic runner come to you when you want to ask your question of the panel. So starting with my right, David Feinberg is the President and CEO of Geisinger Health Systems. Jen Horonjeff is the founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative. Freda Lewis-Hall, Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Pfizer. Michael Loeb, President and CEO of Loeb Enterprises, and Jessica Mega, Chief Medical Officer of Verily. So just to set the stage for you all, I know that you probably know a lot of these numbers, but I think they're worth repeating. So healthcare is a $3.2 trillion enterprise, and it makes up about 18% of our GDP. And yet we see that we have a life expectancy of about 78.8 years, and that is lower than compared to other countries. And we also have an out-of-pocket cost on a year per person basis of $9,500. Now, when I was growing up, my parents said to me, because I think they knew I wasn't going to go in finance, and so they knew I wasn't going to have any money, so they talked a lot about saving your money and using it wisely. So they said to me, you know, when you're thinking about buying something, you should invest in something, and the cost, if you're going to get better quality, it's worth the better cost. So here we are, we're paying all this money for healthcare, and we're not necessarily seeing the end result in terms of our life expectancy, quality of life years adjusted, those kinds of metrics. So I think the question is really, are we measuring the right thing? And so the focus of this panel is really thinking about a B2B model, which is really the traditional model of healthcare, business to business, to a B2C model. If you bring consumers or a B2P model, patients, into that equation, is it going to change what we're measuring? Is it going to change what the outcomes are going to be? Is it going to drive down the cost and increase the value of what we're getting out of the healthcare system? And so that's kind of the overall arching discussion that we're going to have today. And we're going to talk a little bit about if we're shifting, first of all, are we really shifting from a B2B model to a B2C model? If we are, what's needed to get there? Why would we go in that direction? How do we get there? And we're going to listen to the panel. I know that those stark numbers around healthcare are trouble all of us, but I really want our discussion to elevate, to push against that narrative, to push against those numbers, which we all want to see go in a better direction. So we'll end with hopefully a more uplifting note. So I want to start with Jen. Jen, you are a patient advocate. You represent the sort of end game that we're trying to get to in terms of the consumer and patient community. What do you see, and you've also launched a really interesting business model. It's not a new business model, but you are applying it in a really interesting way to the patient community. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I'd love to. And first of all, thank you for having me here, and always happy to represent the patient voice. So as somebody who is a patient myself, growing up with chronic illness, and then went on to the professional side of the equation as an academic and consultant, I really saw that disconnect between all these people talking about patients and genuinely wanting to do right by them, but just not actually ever working with them and talking to them and understanding. And being a patient and very involved with patient communities, saw there's got to be a better way. And there's just this disconnect. So we did something that's actually quite simple in every other industry. We talk to our end users. We do all sorts of customer feedback and voice of the consumer. And so we established a patient co-op. And that means that we are co-owned by patients, and anybody can become a co-owner, and it really empowers patients. And as a service of our co-op, we then connect companies, researchers, or innovators directly with patients in various populations to make sure they're hearing from the right patients at the right time, and they're hearing from diverse patients. And that's something that we were really really just motivated to do to make sure you're not talking to the same people all the time, and that you can really think about how we can reward patients for their contributions to the healthcare system, rather than it just being extractive. Let's test on them, let's take their data, all of these things. How can we elevate them to be experts on their conditions? So we advocate that patients are fairly compensated for when they do consult with industry or otherwise. And that's something that it's hard to stand on a soapbox and say that patients should be heard and fairly valued if we ourselves as an organization didn't do it. So like you say, a co-op is not anything new. Co-ops have been around for centuries. They're a very empowering business model to get various companies together or individuals together. So we then apply that to a platform, a tech platform, where we say that the users, the patients and caregivers, can become co-owners, and that gives them a vote in what we do, and we actually share our profits. So a co-op is a for-profit company that gives its profits away. And so that's really what we do as a way of saying we wouldn't exist without patients. And as a patient, it felt wrong to think about being a sole beneficiary of everybody else doing that work. And so we really just applied this model, and I think the patients, it's the right time. People are ready to be heard and valued, and I think just when we talk about data ownership and things like this, we're actually giving them ownership of the company so that they really feel like we're going to help steer this together.
No, so one of the challenges with moving from a B2B model to a B2C model is that when you think about a business working with another business, there's limited variation in those businesses that they're interacting with.
Yeah.
But when people think about going direct to consumers, consumers and patients are so different.
Yes.
And your model is sort of seeing that as a strength. Can you talk a little bit about why that's a strength and not sort of too complicated or too messy?
Yeah, we need to be hearing from those end users. And I'd hate using user, but as you talk about, is it B2C or B2P? Do we talk about consumers or do we talk about patients? And that's what is something that's challenging in the healthcare system also, is that this term of thinking about consumers, it makes it sound like patients have choice. And they don't always. You don't get to pick out your new car and you get to pay for whatever you want. And so that becomes a little bit more complicated. But when we think about the diverse opinions and preferences of individuals, especially as we have marginalized people of color, people of low health literacy, we need to understand them because it's going to make companies more profitable. Like, this is a win-win for everybody. If you can understand those individuals, we can then reach them, make sure that they are more adherent to their treatment plans, that we have more retention of them in clinical trials, and then ultimately the companies get to design better products and services, which will make them more profitable in the end, and the patients get better things. It's a win-win.
All right, well, so let me move to you, David, because I read a statistic about 8% in administrative costs in the healthcare system, and that's compared to 1 to 3% of administrative costs in the healthcare system in other countries. And we also did a survey, FasterCures did a survey of patients and caregivers, and patients trust providers. And so, but we know that those administrative costs, those administrative burden, is really landing a lot on the provider in the healthcare system. And so as Geisinger Healthcare sort of thought about, Geisinger Health System sort of thought about your model of taking care of your patients, but also making sure that your providers are well taken care of and that they're able to do right by their patients. Can you talk a little bit about the efforts that you've done?
Absolutely. So it's a pleasure to be here, and everything we do at Geisinger is about our patients and our community. So we don't have a meeting, we don't have a board meeting, we don't have a decision made without having a patient voice there. So we've been very early in adopting that. But to me, so much of the discussion is sort of, when we start talking about 8% costs, or Cindy, in your opening remarks about the overall cost of healthcare in America, I think it's because we're talking about the wrong thing. So if we look at, for all of us, whether we're going to live or die, about 20% of that has to do with access to good medical care, good hospitals. You can be born in Philadelphia, 2 miles apart, go to the same doctors in the same hospitals, and have a 25-year difference in life expectancy. It's all the other stuff. It's what you eat, it's transportation, it's your genetic code, it's all these other determinants that decide whether you're going to be healthy. And so our organization, with the voice of the patient, and we would really say it's the voice of the community, has said, well, let's fix all those things. So we take diabetics that are food insecure and are now serving 500,000 meals a year to make sure that basically folks that don't know where their food's going to come from can get healthy food. And guess what? The results of quinoa and carrots are twice as good as metformin, right? So we've seen a 2.5% decrease in hemoglobin A1C levels by giving people food. We have now the largest genetic database in the world that combines genetic information with clinical information to decide what's going to happen to you before it happens so we can prevent it, whether that's breast cancer or those cardiac arrhythmias that cause young athletes to die or high cholesterol based on your genes. So by predicting what's happening, we would call it anticipatory medicine, engaging in our community. If you live within 50 miles of where I live, in that area, or in 25 miles of other areas we've said to you, transportation seems to be an issue. We'll provide free transportation to any of our patients anywhere they need to go. So that's whether to the doctor, to see their friends, or to the grocery store. So eliminate these issues that cause so much of our health burden. The United States, 7 out of 10 Americans are on a prescription medication. So we can either talk, and I guess we'll get to that, about decreasing the cost of prescription meds, or we can get more people off medication. And we think there are really proven social and behavioral ways to get people to live right. It's 5 things. It's really, normal weight, eating right, no smoking, alcohol in moderation, and exercise. If we do that, healthcare costs in America cut in half. And so we've said to our community of about 4 million people, we're going to make that the default. We're going to make that easier. And when you talk to patients, no one wants to be a patient. No one wants to be in the hospital. No one wants to call an 800 number. People want to live their lives. So our goal is to move the discussion and the treatment more toward keeping people healthy rather than trying to fix a system that, as you mentioned, has a lot of inefficiencies in it.
Okay. So when you do all of this work in the communities, for your providers, what's that experience like for them in terms of that connection to the community between the providers, or is the goal really to sort of not have that as much connection and really make that connection with the private provider when somebody does become a patient? Is that really that's the point, is to make that higher quality connection? So
we've made some big moves with our docs. We have about 3,000 providers in our system. And to be a Geisinger doctor, you have to do 5 things. You have to take great care of patients. You have to be involved in teaching and research. You got to help us with same-day appointments. We do 30,000 same-day appointments now a month because patients want to get in. You got to be a good citizen, and you got to help us recruit and retain. If you're seeing a patient who's 65 years or older and you're one of our doctors, the minimum amount of time you can spend with them is 40 minutes. So no doctor is paid on volume in our system. No doctor is rushed through a patient. We want them to spend as much, if they need to spend the entire day with a patient, they're rewarded to do that. Because what we've seen, it's a huge investment, but docs want to work for us. And guess what happens? You see dramatic decrease in ER utilization. You see dramatic decrease in hospitalizations. Because if you give doctors 15 minutes with a patient, all they can do is fight the electronic health record, send them to a bunch of consultants, and never stop and hold their hand and say, are we doing the right thing? Are there any questions you want? So our docs are pressured to spend more time with patients instead of less time, and it's been an incredible opportunity for us. And when they see our patients, they're given information, their whole genetic screen, and where we live, there's a lot of Lyme's disease, but depending on where you are, we give you a different Lyme score. There's a lot of Marcellus shale, so we know where you live on what your rates of respiratory illness. We know based on if you live near livestock, you're going to have higher rates of an antibiotic because they use it in the livestock. So when patients come in, the doc is given an incredible picture of that person's life and where they live before they see them, and we say, we've been expecting you. And we really have planned that visit, and patients are able to help set the agenda. Every patient that leaves the office has all their lab results and all the doctor notes available online, and actually now any of our patients on their iPhone can have their entire medical record. So we're one of the 12 pilots that Apple has used. So you have all your information. The power is with the patient, and the doc and that team helps facilitate that.
That's great. So I haven't ignored you, friends. I'm coming over. So, Freda, you have spent your life really trying to close the gap between innovation and access. And we know that about 50% of new chemical entities come from the United States. That's a really good innovation story. But we also know that about 22% of people, for example, didn't see a consultant for a follow-up appointment because of cost issues. So talk a little bit about how you've driven within Pfizer and within your life's work between getting access to innovation, driving the innovation and ensuring access.
So I can take a step back. Let's stay with the recent experience, I guess, in pharma, because I've done a spectrum of work in the academic environment and research at the NIMH and frontline patient care in the National Health Service Corps. So I've kind of been in a number of these domains, all about identifying the needs of the patients and getting them met. Recently, I've been really excited about what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry and in the biosciences industry in general. And the fact that we've made a dramatic shift from only what the scientists know and thinking about what the regulators want, and really shifting to what patients say they need and what's actually going to make a difference to them in their lives. And so we started to do something similar. In fact, one of my favorite things about patient engagement, Jen, I thought you were going to do this quote. I was sitting on a panel much like this, except there were like thousands of people in the room, and I was very officiously saying, oh yes, well, we're really interested in patient engagement. And one of the most amazing advocates, disruptors, transformers that I know touched me. She said, honey, we've been engaged for 20 years. We're ready to be married now. So married we have become. And so it was really a mind shift to say, okay, it's one thing to have you at the table. It's another thing to ask you some questions. But it's still another thing to involve you step by step, every step of the way, asking you what would transform your life and how we would actually embed that in the clinical trials that we do, how we make you partners as opposed to, I think, Jen, you mentioned it, just mere participants that are passing through, but really fully engaged. And so some of the things that we've done, I'm going to use the access word as access to that as a way of thinking about what we would need to do and how we would need to do it to ensure that the new technology that's being developed in a breathtaking manner actually gets to the people who need it. So some of the things that we're doing from a patient marriage standpoint is to not only ask questions, but begin to involve patients in practicums at the beginning of clinical trials. And by that I mean we, in a recent study, for example, in sickle cell, where we were going to treat patients with a new medicine in the emergency room environment to try and shorten their crises. We asked them questions, but we realized we didn't understand what actually happened when their crisis started. And so we deployed ethnographers to follow them for hours a day and take a look at what happened actually in their homes when they went into crisis, how they attempted to manage it themselves. When they were finally ready to go to an emergency room, how they got there, what those challenges were, what happened when they actually did the intake, what it was like for them to transition onto the trial, what kind of timing burden it was for the nurses and the rest of the medical staff in the emergency room. How did the investigator, and it was really a step-by-step, full-on set of insights into what happened to them, start to finish, if we constructed the trial the way that we had originally intended. And there were some obvious ahas, like a 20-page consent form while you're in sickle cell crisis in the emergency room, probably not the way to go. But there were other subtler things that you couldn't have known unless you had actually lived with the patient through this, like that they're often treated terribly in an emergency room because people think that they're drug seeking. And they often resist going so much that they would stay home for 36, 72 hours in horrible, unbelievable pain before they would actually make that trip to the emergency room. That they didn't call an ambulance. They waited for their sister to come home from work or someone else, because if you called an ambulance, they took you to the first place, not necessarily the place that had your records, that treated you well. So it was like the little tiny steps along the way that transformed the way that we approached the trial. And we've done this over and over in different ways for different patient populations. Our hope and expectation is that we're going to then so intimately understand the needs of patients at the point of service that we'd actually be able to transition these new and innovative medicines to actually get into the hands of the people who need them.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of what you did in that learning was to really respect the fact that patients are expert in their condition, right? That's their expertise. And some of the pushback that we hear within sort of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the complexity of developing these innovations. And like you said, the science is moving at lightning speed. And so as you do that, is there a sense that there's some other expertise that you would like to see come from patient communities, or is there some gap bridging that needs to happen around the expertise that's held up in the biopharmaceutical industry and that patient expertise that they have in their lived experience of their disease?
Well, there's, yes, and we're tapping into as many ways as possible to get share what we know with what they know and see if we come up with kind of the right answer at the end. A lot of work around biomarkers and how you actually measure outcomes in diseases. I had the most fascinating conversation with a mother of a little boy with muscular dystrophy who said, you know, you measure the 6-minute walk test. My son's been in a wheelchair for years. And so that's an interesting measure, but it isn't going to change his life if you change the, you know, the outcome of his 6-minute walk test. So I said, well, what would be a measure that showed you that it was really going to make a difference? She said he uses his iPad for everything. He talks to his friends, he plays his games, he does his schoolwork. If you actually measured the accuracy and speed at which he could maintain his interface with his iPad, and I knew that he could hold on to that a little bit longer. I knew we could hold on to, you know, kind of the quality of his life for a little bit longer. Who would have thought that? So you really needed a caregiver or a patient themselves. There's a lupus patient who informed us, you know, a similar group of scientists that understood the pathology of lupus in an incredible way. We're working with inflammatory biomarkers and, you know, all kinds of really fancy stuff. And the patient said, y'all measuring all that stuff, but you know what changes my life is my fatigue. That's what makes it so I can't take care of my children or do my job or, you know, do what needs to be done around the house. Where are the measures about that? So I think that the patient-reported measurements are a really important place that we're working because they know, and we don't unless we've actually lived it. And then we're using that to incorporate, to teach and learn and exchange. So I think that's a very important part. Engaging technology. You know, we're a very technologic area, incredible Star Wars science is going on where we are. But the interface, like wearables, we haven't fully deployed, and I think patients are teaching us that we have an opportunity to do that. So finding ways that remotely we can monitor patients who have fever, scratching, who have arrhythmias. These are all things that can now be done at a distance. And so you don't have to have a person with an illness get their 6 cells up, get dressed, go somewhere, and, you know, have an interface in a place. You can actually use modern technology to do so at a distance, which is better for them. Continuous monitoring is even better for us because we can pick patterns that we couldn't have conceived of by having, you know, this consistent tracking. So there's this vast interface that patients are teaching us important things about themselves, some of them simple, some of them much more complex than any of us ever thought of. And then they're coming into our complex protocol environments and helping us think about, you know, I've had patients say, I'm not doing that. You can write that down all you want to, not doing it. And so, you know, then you, right? So what great honesty and interface at the very beginning of your protocol development to have people say, I know that sounds right to you, but for me, I can't or I won't. So is there another way around it? And then you're, you know, where you can, you're making it so that the participation is full and our response is full.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think has already kind of come out among your 3 comments is sort of a high touch and low touch approach in terms of using technology, like you said, Freda, to make sure that we're engaging patients and helping them do what they need to do. And Michael, I want to turn to you because as kind of an entrepreneur and an investor and the co-founder of Priceline, you entered into the healthcare system. I want to help us understand sort of why you chose the healthcare system and then what you are hoping to do with your new venture of script relief in terms of addressing the needs of patients.
Right. Well, I think anything that represents 18% of the GNP is going to be attractive. And when you introduced some of the math related to healthcare, I think one of the most stark numbers, you'll pardon me, you didn't quite say. And yes, we're 18% of the GNP in this country. And by the way, if we turn the clock back to 1970, you would find that all of the developed world were bunched between 4, 5, and 6% of GNP. Okay? Today, we're at 18, but if you look at the rest of the developed world, it's like 9, 10, 11, right? So why are we 2x of the developed world? And as you pointed out, we don't have 2x better healthcare. We don't live twice as long. So the question is, where is it? And the problem is, and we've talked a lot about bottoms up type of stuff, which is fine, patient and patient. And by the way, I think I like the notion of changing the word to consumer because patient means you wait, right? And we shouldn't have to do that. We should get great health care and it should be right away. But I think as much as I'm a bottoms up guy, right? I'm a consumer guy. And by the way, what Script Relief is a discount pharmacy card. It works 3 ways. If you are out of network on that particular sale, and that has happened, I'm sure, to everybody in this room, we'll save you about half. By the way, it's a free card. This is not a membership card. Likewise, if you're in your deductible period, we are lower than your insured rate. So if you are in your deductible period, you will find that an insurance company will give you some discount. We are invariably lower than that discount. By the way, another dirty little secret, only 20% or so of everybody choose through their deductible. So think about this, right? I mean, you buy insurance and only 20% of the time do you pierce through that $5,000 or $6,000 deductible cap. The other way we save people money is that we're about 40 or 50% of the time we're lower than the copay, right? Which means, by the way, in those cases, the insurance company is actually making money on the copay, that they're buying the drugs for less and charging you more for the copay. We have about 15 million people who use our product. We're a direct-to-consumer market. We market in a variety of different channels, from online to direct mail. We have a field force of 3,000 people, and we're in 400,000 doctors' offices. And we've saved people about $3 billion cumulatively since we started, which was all not that many years ago. But it is an illustration of the inefficiency. How can I have a free product and deliver it to 15 million people and save them $3 billion? And what I'm really exploiting is a giant inefficiency in the system. And while, again, I'd love to go bottoms up, I think we got to look at the top-down problem, because why are we at 18 and the rest, and why is Denmark at 11? Denmark's a pretty good country. They got pretty good health care, right? Germany, right? And why are they at 10, 11, we at 18? And I think we have to examine that, because if you free up that 7, 8 points, guess what? We really can put the money where it should be, and we can put the money in the right way. And you might ask, what is the fundamental problem? Obviously, if it was a simple answer, we would have solved it already. But a big problem is all of the entities in healthcare, everybody in the supply chain, from patients or consumers, right, to providers, which is code for doctors, to payers, which are insurance companies, governments, and companies, to manufacturers, right, both pharmaceutical manufacturers and device manufacturers, and lawyers, right? everybody hates one another. Not everybody, but everybody does hate the lawyers. But you know, the fact of the matter is there is a tremendous amount of friction between insurance companies and providers, right? And you have doctors and they have patients, but in fact, the payer is somebody entirely different than the patient, right? So when you go to your doctor, you pay your $75 or whatever, and then after that, it's an all-that-you-can-eat salad bar, and the doctor gets paid on a piecework basis, right? So you have this misalignment between outcomes and payers and people who are getting services and people who are giving services. And that is, as much as I am a startup guy and as much as I'm a guy who likes to build B2C businesses, I'm here to say that for the real fix is the structural fix, right? That if we had that extra 7 or 8 points, right, of this $24 trillion economy, that can pay for a lot of stuff.
So Michael, are you saying that in terms of the B2C model that, so I'm interested that sort of Script Relief picked a particular point of inefficiencies in the system, right?
That's correct.
And so I'm interested to learn sort of why did you pick that point of the system, because there are a lot of inefficiencies to choose from,
well,
no shortage as you mentioned.
Because of the math, and here's the math. The math is there are 4.3 billion prescriptions written in this country every year, 4.3 billion. 400 million times a year, which is over 1 million times a day, people are buying a drug out of network, right? Mm-hmm. Another 400 million times, they are prescribed and they don't fulfill, with cost being the major factor. Now, we provide a free card and we give discounts, right? And by the way, another thing you should know is that 85% of the market or thereabouts, when you measure prescriptions, are generics, right? So good old Pfizer, thank you very much, is spending billions and billions and billions on research, right? And then they have a patent. They have a 17-year-old patent. By the time they're in market, it's 14 years. One of the reasons why it's so expensive is you got 14 years of sunshine to make your hay. And then after it's a generic, and in 18 months, they lose 99% of their market, right? So think about that. Think about if you really worked on build your own house, right? It costs you all sorts of money to build your own house, and you get to live there 14 years, and then you got to leave, and somebody else moves in, and it's free. I mean, that doesn't seem fair. And that's what these guys do. And the FDA, in my opinion, is much too stringent and takes much too long, in part because of the thing everybody hates, which is tort attorneys, right? Because we can't lose one. Take flu shots, by the way. So flu shots, a handful of people will die every year because of their flu shots. Well, no manufacturer of a flu shot is building a flu shot unless the government reinsures them, because we'll save tens of thousands of lives from flu shots, right? But because we'll lose a handful of people, right, the tort lawyers will have a heyday, win $100 million every single time, and nobody is making a flu shot unless the government reinsures them. So we got to fix some of the fundamental things. And I hope there's not a lawyer in the room, because I don't think I'm going to make it out of the room if that's the case. But we got to fix the fundamentals, because think of what we can do with 7 or 8 points of the GNP to really put it where it should be, which is all of what you guys are talking about. And we don't have it because of friction in the system.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in this system, and I think we've all sort of thrown out these different data points looking at the system from different angles. And I just want to turn to Verily, because you're supposed to fix this. No, I'm just kidding. But I think you walk into a room, everybody thinks you're so disruptive, and you should sort of assume that. But I'm going to guess, Jessica, that there's some things that you do that are just brass tacks, like really trying to push at some of these inefficiencies in a real practical way. So how are you guys approaching kind of being disruptive and innovative, but also really being tangible and presenting sort of outcomes and connecting people to the innovation?
Sure. Well, I'm glad I'm a doctor. Some of my best friends are lawyers, though. So the thing that struck me, I spend a lot of time in my clinical practice. I'm an inpatient cardiologist and spent many years doing critical care cardiology. And what you see when you're in the hospital is a huge amount of information. So I might, if I'm taking care of someone with diabetes, I'll understand their glucose very frequently. I'll understand the dietary intake. We have nutritionists going around, heart rate, blood pressure. But then it became evident to me that people go home, and that is actually where most of healthcare happens. And so 99% of the time, we're living in the world and we're making health decisions. So did anyone skip breakfast this morning? A few people? So you're sitting here, and we know that your glucose levels are very different than other folks. But what we realized at Verily is, can we take technology, and just for those of you who are less familiar with the company, we grew out of Google. So when I joined, we were part of Google X. And Google X is the group thinking about next generation ways of integrating information. So there I was as a cardiologist sitting next to folks working on the driverless car. But these are all information problems. And so the idea, and your question about what is actually the brass tacks, is hooking people together with their own information. And if you think about Google, Google has 7 products that touch over 1 billion people. So this is a company that is oriented towards the person. And so the very tangible brass tacks example I can turn to is a partnership with patients with diabetes. And what we're trying to do is extend the reach. So I may see someone in the hospital with diabetes, and I might give you a laundry list. So it's wonderful to meet you. What I'd like you to do is eat healthy, take your insulin, take your oral medications, maybe a little quinoa, because we learned that worked earlier today. You got to get your feet checked, your eyes checked, and I really want you to exercise. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And all of a sudden, someone leaves the office. And what we've learned from listening to patients is that there are ways to connect people and understand what really motivates someone. And I think we've heard every person on the panel think about both the business model as well as the patient. And so what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we bring these technologies to patients? And so we have a partnership with Sanofi right now, and have formed a joint venture called Onduo, which the team doesn't love me to say this, but I think it will never be done. We're starting by bringing glucose values directly to patients so they can understand their own responses to therapies. So they can also understand their own responses to different foods. There's really interesting research out there that suggests if I eat a banana based on my microbiome, I may respond differently than you do. And so we are surfacing those insights directly to patients with the support of coaches, with the support of physicians, but it turns the model on its head, and I actually think it extends our work as physicians. People always ask me, is being a doctor a good job? I think it's an amazing job. But we have to start to do a better job of connecting where people want their care. So that's a very tangible example of how a company that came out of Google, that's now Verily, we're the branch of Alphabet focused on healthcare and life science, but it's how we're bringing integrated technology and bringing it directly to patients on their phone where they are.
So one of the pushbacks we hear is patient burden. And so you painted a really good picture about people who live their lives and manage their disease and manage their lives, and they're spending a lot of effort doing that. And yet there's also this real concern, we're burdening the patient. How can we possibly give them their health data? What are they going to know what to do with it? So talk a little bit about how you all are thinking about that when you try to engage with patients, or consumers. Do they want that information? How do they want it? Are you thinking about that in terms of the back and forth between the community and the consumer, and the types of technologies that you can offer?
Yeah, so I think it's the burden is on us to understand how to help people understand this information. We ask people to understand information all of the time. And it's not to say if someone ends up in the critical care unit, there's a reason you want a doc there to help you navigate that journey. But what we're finding through this Onduo program is that people want to focus on different areas. And on the back end, when you have that data, you can start to layer in ML. You can start to figure out when people are actually making an intervention. You can surface insights that are useful as opposed to just bombarding people with information. And the other thing we've started to do is we're on a journey with a project called Project Baseline. And I gave you the example of all of the health information we have in the 4 walls of the hospital, but we're really trying to unlock all of the health that's going on outside of the hospital. And right now, just to give you an example, we have probably, any person in the room probably has a few gigabytes of health data sitting in some health system. In the next 10 to 20 years, the estimate, and that, for example, for anyone who still uses CDs, that's like 5 CDs. I used that example the other day with my kids, and they didn't know what a CD was. But this idea that we're actually going to have probably about 15,000 CDs worth of information, and that's where health really is going to be occurring. And so I think that we need to start empowering each of us, empowering people with health data. And it's going to be a journey, but I think it's one that we're embracing.
So I want to give a heads up to the audience. We're going to open up for questions, so be thinking, but I want to get some discussion going. So Freda, did you look like you said we're going to say something?
I always look like I'm going to say something. Well, two things. So you forced me to say it. I always get in trouble every time I do. But one of the things that's happening, I think you're starting. So it's the whole idea that we literally have Star Wars medicine happening right now. The science is incredible. The rate at which it's being delivered is mind-blowing. But we're delivering the Star Wars medicine into the Flintstones healthcare system. And so our ability, we have these elegant, integrated systems here and there, and everybody is struggling to do their best, but it is disconnected, and we're disconnected from it. I just have to share, I didn't have a Google moment, but I had an Amazon moment in my doctor's office. I've been going for 8 years, same doctor. I walked into the waiting area, and they handed me a clipboard with a piece of paper on it, write your name and address. So I melted down. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I've been coming here for 8 years for some of the most intimate care that you could possibly imagine.
That sounds like a Flintstone moment to me right there.
I was like, what is going on right now? I order 5 things on Amazon. They know how old I am, what size I am. My son likes Megaforce Power Rangers, not Dino Charge Power Rangers, and all kinds of stuff about me. And you want me to write my name and address? I'm not doing it. So she stood there though, but wait a minute, she won in the end, even after my meltdown. She had the clipboard like this. So I calmed down, I took it and I said, I'm sorry, you want me to just sit right over here? You have a pen. But it's, either that's how you're getting your care or you're not getting care, depending on where you are and, And so I think we have an opportunity to knit together these incredible insights, the data that we have, the platforms and the ways in which we're delivering care in strikingly beautiful ways, to bring those together and then scale it. And that we have not done yet. So I'm really excited about the notion that that's what this kind of energy in the room and on the panel has an opportunity to do.
We have a clinic in Manahawkin, New Jersey. When you come in, it's based on facial recognition, so they would recognize you. There's no waiting room. It's multi-specialty, so they text you, you're ready to be seen in physical therapy, or your primary care doc's ready. So we created this kind of a patient experience that you would expect in any other industry.
I love it.
We went into a market where we've had no presence. We've seen 100,000 people in 6 months. So if you build it, they come, and we do have you do some biometrics in the beginning, but then it's all based on facial recognition when you come in, which is, happening everywhere else.
I'll just see you in Manhattan.
There you go, there you go. But can I just add on the Star Wars medicine comment? So I'm 56 years old. When I was born, under 1% of the population had type 2 diabetes. Assuming I live a normal lifetime, another 30 years, it's going to be 30% of the population will have type 2 diabetes. That's one disorder. It is food-borne. We don't need anything fancy to get people to eliminate type 2 diabetes, right? We need to make sure they have access to healthy food. It's that simple. And when we throw technology on those things, I think we're looking oftentimes at trying to manage type 2 diabetes when it is something that we've seen with people, even unengageable people. We can engage them and make their diabetes go away by making sure they have access to the education, the transportation, and the food. And it's a huge cost saver, because all of us, who I'm assuming in the room are not food insecure, are paying for the care for those people that are food insecure, because they're either covered by Medicaid or Medicare or some other thing that doesn't cover our cost. And so it's a burden on us, and we're not using really effective treatments to make people better. So to me, some of the Star Wars stuff is phenomenal, but I think we've also lost the basics.
Yeah, it may be unnecessary. So, gene editing and all kinds of amazing things where behaviors are not going to change it. I guess it was your point, if we kind of took our assets from one area and put them in these areas that can't be fixed by other things. But again, I think it's a system. And can I add one other thing, which is the other thing that we don't have is an agreed upon set of metrics around what, you know, when are we there? At what point will we have been there? Is it a financial measurement? Is it, you know, kind of having or taking back down to a different time, the number of people that are affected by diabetes? I'm not sure that if we queried even the experts in, you know, healthcare and health outcomes, that we would get a set of agreed upon metrics. And that may be a start where you're trying to go. And
we'd all go for more years in our life and life in our years.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So I want to address one thing and give you, I think, a salient point, which is we had in Obamacare a once in two generation opportunity to change things for the better. And I appreciate the spirit and the goodwill that went behind it, but the unfortunate thing is not what Obamacare did, it's what it didn't do. And in an effort to make sure that pre-existing conditions were eliminated, we went to something called community-based pricing. Now there's about 400 in the United States, right? So these are big pieces of geography, and everybody gets priced the same, right? Which means, right, that guy who is 400 pounds and eats at McDonald's morning, noon, and night, and drinks a fifth of scotch and rides a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour without his helmet on is in the same pool as you and gets charged the same amount of money. And you want to change things, right? If you want to change things, one very simple thing is that incentives, right? Align incentives with outcomes, right? And one of the enormous parts, one of the enormous problems in the entire system is that we don't, right? So doctors, back to an example I mentioned, piecework basis, right? They get paid for every shot and every lab test. So what do, right? They overprescribe. Now, insurance companies know that, and they audit everything, and they pay slow, and they don't pay about 20% of the time. So all of a sudden, doctors want to give it to the man. So they super overprescribe everything because they know they're going to be edited back. But we have long ago, because of the way the system is set up, we have misaligned incentives and outcomes. And it's been a long time since you doctors on the panel have been practicing the type of medicine that you want to practice, which is you and a patient and just doing the right thing for the patient. I'll be done in a second, but my brother-in-law is a surgeon, right? And he prescribes antibiotics every single time. Even though in med school it said use your judgment, and it should be about 20% of the time. He does it every single time. The reason for that is he doesn't want to, in case he's going to get sued, and you get sued. In case he's sued, he doesn't want to be on the stand and they say, you know, good doctor, why did you not prescribe antibiotics? Well, in med school I learned use my judgment. Well, that's being called in question right now, sir, right? So overprescribe everything, too many tests, too many things, because we are really far structurally away from where it was doctors and patients. And what I'm saying is to wring out that 6, 7, 8%, we got to restore that. And that, by the way, is not a bottoms-up thing, right? That's not the Star Wars to the Flintstones. I want to address the Flintstones. And part of it is aligning incentives and making sure that patients and providers and payers and manufacturers, right, are all on the same page.
I mean, one of the things that's kind of been painted here is just sort of that system. You guys know those blobs where you push on one side and then it bulges out on the other side. It's like wherever you kind of stick in an intervention into the system, it kind of causes this backlash or this backfiring of another part of the system.
If you don't mind, I would love to jump in and comment a little bit on what both gentlemen have said, because when we talk about insurance, and I'm not going to go off the rails with that, but when you think about that, that goes back to that, like, patient compliance. How are we incentivizing the reckless motorcycle rider or whomever? And that's more of an extreme example, but just the average patient who maybe has a chronic illness, that can't get to the doctor, that has other healthcare costs that they're trying to cover. Their medication makes them feel like crap, so they know if they take it, they don't get to go to work the next day, or all these different things. By looking at it and putting all that sort of onus on the patient, oh, they're just non-compliant. That's why they're not doing it. And just to blame them when it's the system that is actually to be blamed, that we all need to be thinking about to make sure that the patient can adhere to their treatment plan. I think that's one of the major issues, and something that you touched upon of, are we throwing technology on top of things? And that's in the context of diabetes, but just in general, we have all this money, as you said, being pumped into like digital health, and it's amazing, but are we also thinking about, are we solving problems that patients actually have? We're just giving them more stuff, and is that making them less compliant because they can't keep up with answering the questions on their app and doing whatever else they need to do? So that's where we really take it back to talk to the patients. Understand what they go through. I really appreciate hearing about the ethnographic research that you all are doing, because it's so important to really just understand the person and make sure that we're making a meaningful impact and not just throwing a bunch of Star Wars at them.
Yeah, I would really like to follow up on that. My general philosophy is that we should only use these tools in the sense that they help people in their day-to-day life. So there's a reason why people may use maps, for example. Has anyone used a maps tool in the last week? And the reason we use it is it helps us navigate our lives. And I think the point about making sure that people eat the right food and have the right support is so critical. It's not about, anyone who I work with will say, I go around saying, we just can't create widgets for widgets' sake. It's what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then do everything we can to try to support those healthy decisions. So you're absolutely right. You have to start with the problem. And I think that was really your original question about the blocking and tackling. What are we really solving for? We're solving for better patient outcomes. And then the idea around aligning incentives. Certainly at Geisinger, the model there has thought about how to do that. And I would say in the programs where we're engaged in, we are now aligning with outcomes. So it only works, for example, if someone gets healthier. We should only be reimbursed in that way, and then all of a sudden the incentives are much more aligned. With that being said, I do think that there's a wave of understanding that outcomes-centric models are the ones that are going to be the ones that move forward, and I think physicians are on the forefront of trying to make that change.
So do we have any questions from the audience at all? Yep, somebody in the back there.
Hi.
Oh, you've got a mic.
Hi, my name is Quinn. I'm a business school student at UPenn. I had a question around, there's a growing trend of multi-generational families, and with the baby boomers, a lot of, younger people are taking care of their parents, but not everybody in the family is on the same, health insurance or not through the same payer. So there aren't any incentives for the payers to really take care of the caregivers of the patients that they're insuring. I was wondering if anyone can comment on what is, the health system is thinking about addressing that problem, and has there been any innovative examples, to take care for family caregivers?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about the patient side, but the caregiver side is really important.
We see that in talking about employee benefit programs to support the caregiver, because they would have lost productivity or time at work as they may be taking care of an elderly parent or a child. So we're seeing some of those examples of how they can support kind of from an employee standpoint. But it's so important, because that's the whole thing, is it's not just infecting an individual, it's affecting them, at the whole touch points of all the different people that they're working with, either their employees or their family members.
Yeah, we set up our programs to care for anybody, even if they're not insured by us, because we know it'll affect the patients that are insured by us, and then we win them over and get them to buy our insurance. So that's how
Great. So I want to close by a lightning round, because we're running low on time, and I want us to make sure we've really talked a lot about sort of the inefficiencies in the system, some of the pain points in the system, but I want us to leave with a forward-leaning, if not optimistic, at least sort of on the horizon perspective of where you think the trends are going and what you think this audience could attend to. What's one thing that you think we could attend to? And that kind of also gives you bragging rights for future global conferences, if you're right, about what we're supposed to be attending to in the future. So let's start down here with you, Jessica.
So I think the idea that health and health information is a black box that only is held by a few is something that you see eroding. You see CMS leading that charge. I also think the idea of traditional healthcare is going to extend to health broadly, and so I would encourage all of us to really start with ourselves. What are the things that are really impacting our health on a day-to-day basis, and how do we put people in the center of it?
So I would make the point that in 1900, longevity was about 45 years, and we're now at about 79, so we're going in the right direction. So I think we're going to continue having better and better care.
So I'll pick up off of what you said, which is, I agree, we're living longer by some measurements, but other people might say that we're taking longer to die. So I think what's going to happen in the future is that we're not only going to add time, but also quality, and that we'll do so by leveraging data and what I refer to as medical aberrations. So using data to help better inform, understand, and the medical aberration, because if I think about the various pieces and parts that exist, I think we have everything we need. We have enough money, we have enough people, we have enough smarts. We just need to identify the problem we're trying to solve, and then all hands on deck. And I believe that that's going to happen in short order, because it must.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to put a date on that? No?
No, ma'am.
I understand. All right.
I mean, I think it's the goal of this panel to be talking about how we can be getting more patients really to take control over their care and to be empowered to do the things that they need to do, either lifestyle-wise or otherwise. So I think that the trend is going to continue to hear from patients, to see that the more we talk about these buzzwords of patient centricity, patient experience, patient engagement, they all have the same word in them, and we really need to make sure that we're thinking about that. I mean, nobody wants to fix healthcare more than patients, because like you say, they don't want to be patients. So I think the more that we talk about these things, I would like to hope that we're going to see more of the industry engaging with those patients so that together we can co-design those new solutions.
So I would say hopefully in 5, but certainly in 10 years, there'll be no more waiting rooms. People will be getting care at home. The whole focus will be on making it easy to be a patient, and all the hassle will be gone, as we've seen it in every other industry, right? I can get any movie I want. I can book a thing online, but still you're getting clipboards when you show up at doctors. I think that will disappear, and if we don't do it as a healthcare industry ourselves, I keep saying some Stanford dropout in a black turtleneck is going to do it to us, so that's why we're convinced to try to do it ourselves.
Yeah, and I'll take the moderator prerogative and also set out a vision which I think is about metrics and trying to solve problem identification and then knowing that you've gotten there. So I think in very short order, I think we'll find a way to sort of collectively understand this mishmash of statistics and data points that we kind of threw at you today collectively. And we'll be able to say, these are the sets of problems. What's the problem set that we're trying to solve for? And then come up with metrics of success around that problem set that go beyond life expectancy, that go beyond longevity, that go beyond numbers of new medications in the system or number of people insured, that really get at these kinds of really important things like, are we living the life that we want to live? Are we leading a meaningful life per the prior global conference last year theme? And are we really having the quality of life that we want? And not just for ourselves as patients or individuals, but as communities and as caregivers of those people who are in our network and in our family and in our communities. So I hope that will happen. I won't put a date on it either, but I will say that I hope that it'll happen soon, and I think it will. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you to my panelists for the wonderful contribution to the discussion.